My name is Tommy Carter, and what I'm about to tell you happened on Christmas Eve 1978 in a little snow-buried town just outside Duluth, Minnesota, when I was only 8 years old and my 74-year-old grandma Evelyn Mae was locked outside barefoot in a deadly blizzard by my own father, all because she dared to bring me one small wrapped Christmas gift and what the police finally uncovered 34 years later underneath her frozen tomato garden shattered what was left of our family forever and changed everything I thought I knew about love, forgiveness, and pure evil hiding behind a smile. If you're new here or if you've been with me for a while, please hit that subscribe button and the little bell right now, because this story is going to reach straight into your heart and squeeze until you can hardly breathe, and by the time we are done, you'll be messaging your children, your grandchildren, and everyone in your prayer group, telling them they have to hear what happened to little Tommy and his grandma Evelyn. So go ahead and subscribe with notifications on, because I'm not stopping until every single word is told, and you deserve to know the whole truth from the very beginning. It was December 24, 1978, and the snow was already coming down so thick you couldn't see the end of the driveway from the front porch of our little greenhouse on Pine Ridge Road in Clover Valley, Minnesota. The weatherman on WDSM radio kept warning this was going to be the worst blizzard since the Armistice Day storm of 1940, with wind chills dropping to 50 below and every school and business shut down tight. But inside our house the air felt colder than anything outside, because my Daddy Roy Carter had started drinking at noon, and when Daddy drank, something dark and mean crawled right into his eyes and took over. Grandma Evelyn lived just 2 miles away in the same little white house she and Grandpa Harold built with their own hands after he came back from the war in 1945. But ever since Grandpa passed in '74, Daddy had decided Grandma was poison, and he forbade her from coming near me, saying she made me soft with her stories and her hugs and her butterscotch candies. But Grandma didn't care one bit what Roy Carter said. She loved me with every ounce of her 74-year-old heart, and every Sunday after church she would slip me a candy and whisper, "You are my special little man, Tommy, and kindness will always beat meanness in the end. You remember that?" That Christmas Eve around 4 o'clock the phone rang, and Mama answered with her voice already shaking, because she knew it was Grandma calling to say she was on her way, walking through the storm with my present like she had every single year. No matter how mad Daddy got, Mama tried to stop her, whispering, "Evelyn, please, it's too dangerous. Roy's already halfway through a fifth of Seagrams." But Grandma just laughed that soft bell laugh and said, "Darlene, I've walked through worse than this to see my grandson on Christmas, and I'll be there in 30 minutes with hot cocoa and a surprise, so don't you fret." Sure enough, at 4:45 I heard the crunch of footsteps on the fresh snow, and I ran to the living room window, and there she was, my beautiful Grandma Evelyn, bundled in her old brown coat with the fur collar, snowflakes sparkling in her white hair like diamonds, her cheeks red as apples, carrying a thermos in one hand and a tiny red box tied with silver ribbon in the other, smiling the biggest smile I'd ever seen. But the second I yelled, "Grandma's here," Daddy stormed and snatched the curtain shut and growled, "You get away from that window, boy. She ain't welcome here no more." I started begging, "Daddy, please, it's Christmas Eve. She walked all this way," but he grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises and said, "I told you that woman is poison, and tonight she learns what happens when she disobeys me." Mama tried to step in, whispering, "Roy, please, not in front of Tommy," but he backhanded her so fast she hit the floor with blood running from her lip, and I froze because I had never seen him hit her right in front of me before. Grandma must have heard the yelling, because she started knocking soft at first, then harder, calling, "Darlene, honey, it's me, let me in, it's so cold." But Daddy marched to the door, flung it open just long enough to rip the thermos and the little red gift out of her hands and hurl them into the snowbank. Then he shoved her backward with both hands so hard she fell clean off the porch, landing flat on her back in 8 inches of fresh powder. I screamed and tried to run to her, but Daddy slammed the door and locked it, and then he did the cruelest thing I will never forget as long as I live. He grabbed Grandma's old snow boots that she always left by our door every winter just in case, and he opened the door again and threw those boots as far as he could into the blizzard, screaming, "Now try walking home, you meddling old witch." Grandma struggled to her knees, coughing snow from her lungs, but she still tried to smile at me through the window, pressing her bare hands to the frosty glass, mouthing, "I love you, Tommy, be brave." And then Daddy yanked the curtains closed and dragged me kicking and screaming to the kitchen while Mama sobbed on the floor holding her bleeding mouth. Outside the wind howled like 100 wolves, and every few minutes I could hear Grandma's weak voice, "Tommy honey, Grandma's all right, don't cry." But by 7 o'clock the knocking stopped and the silence felt worse than any screaming. I crawled back to the window and peeked through a crack, and there she was, still on the porch, barefoot, coat open because she had wrapped it around the little red box she'd dug out of the snowbank, trying to keep my gift dry, her hair iced solid, her lips turning blue yet. She held up the box and mouthed, "Merry Christmas, my sweet boy," and then she turned and started the long walk home, leaving tiny red footprints where her bare feet had already cut open on the ice. I beat on the glass with both fists, screaming, "Grandma, come back," but Daddy grabbed me by the hair, threw me into my bedroom and locked the door from the outside, and I curled up on the floor crying until my throat was raw and all I could think about was those bare feet in that killing cold. The next morning, Christmas Day, the blizzard had stopped and the world was silent and white. Daddy acted like nothing happened, made Mama cook breakfast, told me to open my presents, but there was no little red box, and when I asked about Grandma he snapped, "Mind your own business and eat." But Mama's eyes were swollen shut from crying and she kept staring toward Grandma's house 2 miles away. Around noon the phone rang. Mama answered and dropped the receiver, screaming, "Oh God, no!" And Daddy grabbed it and his face went white as the snow, and he whispered, "Evelyn," and slammed the phone down, told Mama to stay with me, and he ran out the door without even a coat. What Daddy found when he got to Grandma's house was the front door blown open by the wind. Snow drifted across the kitchen floor, the cocoa thermos cold on the table, and Grandma herself lying face down in her frozen tomato garden, still clutching my little red gift box against her chest, her bare feet black with frostbite, her body stiff because she had made it home but went out back to bury my present under her favorite tomato plant like she always did every year, so I could dig it up like treasure. When spring came, but the cold took her before she could get back inside, and she died right there on her knees in the snow with my Christmas gift pressed to her heart. The coroner said she'd been dead for hours. The police came, asked questions, but Daddy told them Grandma was old and confused and must have wandered outside in the night, and nobody ever said a word about him locking her out barefoot or throwing her boots into the storm because Mama was too terrified and I was only 8 and didn't know how to make anyone listen. Grandma Evelyn Mae Carter was buried 3 days later, and Daddy stood at the grave looking sorry for exactly 5 minutes before he went right back to the bottle. But what nobody knew, not even Mama, was that Grandma had written a long letter that night, tucked it inside the little red box with my gift, and managed to bury it under the tomato plant just like she planned, and there it stayed frozen in Minnesota dirt for 34 years waiting. September 2012. I was 42, living in Arizona, when the phone rang and the new owner of Grandma's little white house said they were putting in a new septic line, and the backhoe hit a metal box wrapped in oilskin, and inside was a silver locket with my baby picture, Grandma's letter dated Christmas Eve 1978, and something else, something that made them call the sheriff immediately, because what Grandma buried with my gift that night was proof of a secret so dark my father had killed to keep it hidden, and her dying act was making sure the truth would one day come out. And what the police followed from that letter straight to the old root cellar under Grandma's garden made grown deputies cry and the district attorney say, "This is the coldest case I've ever seen." The second the new owner of Grandma's little white house said the words, "We found a metal box, and the sheriff is here," my knees buckled right there in my kitchen in Mesa, Arizona, and I had to grab the counter because 34 years of buried years came rushing back like that Minnesota blizzard had followed me all the way to the desert. And the woman on the phone, Mrs. Linda Erickson, a retired schoolteacher from Iowa who bought the place in 2009, kept saying, Mr. Carter, are you still there?" And I finally found my voice and whispered, "Did you open it yet?" And she got real quiet and said, "The sheriff told me not to touch another thing after he saw what was inside the letter and the other item, but he needs you to come to Minnesota as soon as you can because your grandmother left instructions that only you, Tommy, could decide what happens next, and whatever is down in that root cellar belongs to you now." I hung up the phone and just stood there staring at the calendar on my fridge, still turned to September 2012, and I realized I hadn't been back to Clover Valley since the day I turned 18 and hitchhiked out with $23 and the clothes on my back, swearing I would never breathe that cold air again. But Grandma had reached across 34 frozen years and pulled me home with one last gift, and I knew I had no choice. I booked the first flight to Duluth for the next morning, and the whole plane ride I kept touching the silver locket they had overnight to me, the one from the box with my baby picture inside, and on the back engraved in Grandma's shaky handwriting, "To my brave Tommy, the truth will keep you warm when nothing else can." Christmas Eve 1978. When I landed, the air smelled exactly the same, pine and snow and wood smoke, and my chest hurt so bad I thought I was having a heart attack, but it was just memory slamming into me like a freight train. Sheriff Dan Olson, a man I used to deliver newspapers to when I was 10, met me at the airport, and he hugged me like a son and said, "Tommy, your grandma was the finest woman I ever knew, and what she did the night she died is the bravest thing I've ever seen in 30 years wearing this badge." And then he handed me Grandma's letter sealed in an evidence bag and said, "Read it in private first, because once you read it there's no going back." I waited until I was alone in the rental car in the Duluth airport parking garage, and I pulled that letter out, and the paper was still perfect because oilskin had kept every word safe, and it started, "My dearest Tommy, if you are reading this, then I am already with Jesus, and your daddy's secret is still hidden, but I could not go to my grave letting him win, so listen close, my sweet boy, because Grandma is going to tell you everything I never could while I was living, and when you finish reading this, you go straight to the root cellar under the back porch, and you dig exactly 4 feet down from the northeast corner, and you will find what I buried the night your granddaddy Harold really died, because what the world was told in 1974 was a lie, a terrible lie your daddy forced me to keep by threatening to take you away from me forever." My hands started shaking so hard I could barely hold the pages, and I had to pull over twice on the drive to Clover Valley because tears kept blinding me. Grandma wrote that on Christmas Eve 1978, while she had planned to leave me the locket and $20 and her wedding ring like always, but when Daddy threw her out barefoot she knew she might not make it home alive, so she wrote the letter by flashlight while she walked those 2 miles home, stopping every few steps to catch her breath because her lungs were freezing, and she told the whole truth about the night Grandpa Harold disappeared. She said Harold never died of a heart attack in his sleep like Daddy told the town and the coroner and the preacher. She said on October 12, 1974, she woke up at 2 in the morning to find Harold gone from their bed, and when she went looking she found Daddy Roy in the root cellar, drunk and covered in blood, standing over Harold's body with the splitting maul still in his hands, and Daddy looked up at her with those same devil eyes he had Christmas Eve and said, "Mama, you didn't see nothing, or I swear I'll kill Darlene and the boy too and make it look like an accident." And Grandma fell to her knees begging him not to do this. Harold was his own father, but Daddy just kept saying the old man was gonna turn him in for stealing from the mill and he wasn't going back to prison, no sir, not ever. So he made Grandma help him carry Harold's body out to the tomato garden and bury him right there under the dairy plants we ate from every summer, and then he forced her to call the doctor the next morning and lie and say Harold died peaceful in his sleep, and because Grandma was terrified of losing me and Mama, she kept that lie for 4 long years until the night Daddy locked her out and she decided if she was going to die she was taking his secret with her, but in a way he couldn't burn or destroy, so she wrapped the real evidence in oilskin with my gift and the letter and buried it in the one place she knew he'd never dig the root cellar because he was too scared of Grandpa's ghost to ever go down there again. When I finished reading I was sobbing so hard the letter was wet with tears, and I drove straight to the little white house on Pine Ridge Road, and there was yellow police tape everywhere and Sheriff Olson and 2 deputies and Mrs. Erickson all standing in the backyard looking pale as ghosts, and the sheriff said, "Tommy, we got the ground-penetrating radar like your grandma's map said, and there's definitely remains down there 4 feet deep just like she wrote, and we're waiting on you before we dig." Because she said only you can decide if the world knows what Roy Carter really is. I walked over to that tomato garden where I used to run through barefoot every July picking warm tomatoes with Grandma, and I knelt down in the cold dirt and I whispered, "I'm here, Grandma, I came back and I'm not afraid anymore." And Sheriff asked me one more time, "Are you sure you want us to do this?" And I looked him in the eye and said, "Dig, because my grandma died to give me this moment and I'm not letting her down again." They started digging slow and careful, and about 20 minutes later one of the deputies hollered, and we all looked down, and there he was, Grandpa Harold, still wearing the same red flannel shirt he had on the last time I saw him alive, only now it was rotten and stained dark, and his skull had a giant split right across the top where the maul had landed, and even though I was 42 years old I started crying like that 8-year-old boy again, and Sheriff Olson put his arm around me and said, "We got him, Tommy, we finally got him justice." And then the deputy held up something else wrapped in the same oilskin, a little mason jar, and inside that jar, floating in formaldehyde, was a perfect bloody thumbprint on a piece of cardboard, and on the cardboard in Grandma's handwriting, "Roy Carter, October 12, 1974. He made me watch," and Sheriff said that's all we need for DNA and murder one, because Minnesota never had a statute of limitations on murder and your daddy is going to prison for the rest of his life. But here's what nobody was ready for when they ran that DNA from the thumbprint and the bones. It didn't just match my daddy Roy Carter, it matched someone else too, because Grandpa Harold wasn't my daddy's real father, and the man whose blood was on that maul was a whole different monster, the one Grandma hinted at in the last line of her letter when she wrote, "Tommy, there's one more secret in this house, and when you find it you'll understand why I could never leave Clover Valley no matter how bad it got, and that secret is waiting under the floorboards in my bedroom, and only you can decide if it stays buried or comes into the light." And that's where part 3 begins, because what I found when I pried up those old pine boards made the sheriff cancel his Thanksgiving plans and call in the state boys, and it turned our family story into something the national news couldn't stop talking about for months. I stood in Grandma Evelyn's little bedroom, the one that still smelled faintly of lilac talcum powder and the same pink rose wallpaper she hung in 1962, and the afternoon sun was slanting through the lace curtains making dust dance like tiny angels, while Sheriff Dan Olson and 2 deputies watched me kneel on the floor with a crowbar I borrowed from Mrs. Erickson's garage, and my hands were shaking so bad because Grandma's last line in that frozen letter kept burning behind my eyes. "Tommy, there's one more secret in this house, and when you find it you'll understand why I could never leave Clover Valley no matter how bad it got." And I jammed that crowbar under the 3rd pine board from the window just like she wrote, and the nails screamed as I pried, and the board came up with a crack that echoed like a gunshot, and the smell that rolled out of that hiding place hit us all so hard Sheriff Olson actually gagged, and one deputy ran outside to throw up because it wasn't just dust and mouse nests. Down there it was the smell of old blood, and something worse, something sweet rotten that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. I reached in with a flashlight and the beam landed on a yellowed shoebox wrapped 3 times in plastic grocery bags, and when I pulled it up the plastic crackled like dry leaves and Sheriff said, "Tommy, maybe you don't have to do this yourself, let us," but I told him, "No sir, this is between me and Grandma," and I tore that plastic open right there on her braided rug, and inside the shoebox was a stack of Polaroid pictures, at least 30 of them, all taken with one of those old swinger cameras, and the first one I picked up made my stomach flip clean over because it showed a little boy maybe 4 or 5 years old, naked and crying with bruises on his arms and legs and a man's hand holding him down, and when I turned the picture over, Grandma had written in her perfect schoolteacher handwriting, "Roy, age 4, 1953 to 52. Reverend Paulson's basement," and I dropped it like it was on fire and grabbed the next one, and every single one was worse, showing the same little boy, my daddy Roy. At different ages from 4 to maybe 12, being hurt in ways no child should ever know by a man in a black clergy shirt with a white collar, and every photo had a date and a name and sometimes a place like church camp or the parish house or the Reverend's Buick, and tucked between the pictures were little envelopes with locks of Roy's baby hair, and one even had a dried red-brown stain that I knew without testing was blood. Sheriff Olson took one look and whispered, "Sweet Jesus, it's a pedophile ring," and Grandma documented the whole thing for 8 years, and then at the very bottom of the shoebox, wrapped in a 1959 church bulletin, was a tiny reel-to-reel tape, the kind we used in school AV class, and a note in Grandma's handwriting that said, "Play this for the police when you are strong enough, Tommy, because the devil himself is on this tape and he has my son's screams recorded forever." We carried everything out to the sheriff's cruiser and drove straight to the station, and within 30 minutes the conference room looked like a war room. State troopers, Minnesota BCA agents, 2 FBI agents from Minneapolis flying in, because this wasn't just one predator, this was Reverend Ezekiel Paulson, the beloved pastor of Clover Valley Lutheran from 1948 to 1972, the man who baptized me, who married my parents, who gave the eulogy at Grandpa Harold's fake funeral, the man the whole town called Saint Zeke, and Grandma had proof he'd been molesting little boys for decades and keeping trophies, and my daddy Roy had been one of his very first victims, and the tape, oh Lord have mercy on my soul, when they played that tape in the evidence room with headphones so I wouldn't have to hear it out loud, the agent listening turned green and had to step out, and when he came back he said, "We've got multiple children's voices on here begging and crying, and one very clear adult voice giving instructions. And it matches the voice on the old church sermon recordings we just pulled from the library, so it's him, it's definitely Reverend Paulson, and he recorded his crimes like trophies." I sat there in that plastic chair feeling like the whole world had tilted sideways, because everything I thought I knew about hate and forgiveness and family crashed together in my head. Daddy had been turned into a monster because a monster got him first when he was just a little boy with curly blonde hair and trusting eyes, and Grandma knew the whole time, and instead of turning Paulson in, she stayed silent to protect Roy, and then Roy grew up and killed his own stepfather Harold to keep the secret buried, and then he turned that same violence on me and Mama and Grandma, and the circle just kept spinning uglier and uglier until Grandma finally said enough and used her very last night on earth to break it wide open. Sheriff Olson sat down across from me and said, "Tommy, we're opening 37 cold cases tonight, because once we had Paulson's name, other towns started calling in boys who grew up and became men and never told a soul, but now they're ready, and at least 9 of them are willing to testify, and we already found the Reverend's private journals buried in the church vault, and it's worse than we thought. He ruined dozens of lives, maybe hundreds, and your Grandma is the only reason any of them will ever See justice, but there's one more thing, and he slid a new evidence bag across the table, and inside was a single gold wedding band, the one Grandma wore every day of her life, and inside the band was engraved HE to EM 1944, and Sheriff said we found it clenched in Grandpa Harold's skeleton hand when we pulled him out of the garden today. He must have grabbed it off Grandma's finger the night Roy killed him. Maybe she dropped it in the struggle, or maybe Harold was trying to protect her one last time, and now we know why Grandma could never leave Clover Valley. No matter how bad Roy got, she was staying to guard those floorboards to make sure the truth didn't die with her, and she waited until she knew she was dying to send me back here to finish what she started. I took that wedding ring and slipped it on my pinky where it fit perfect, and I looked Sheriff straight in the eye and said, "Arrest my father for Harold's murder tonight. I'll testify to everything I remember from Christmas Eve 1978, and I want every single person who ever protected Reverend Paulson dragged into the light too." And Sheriff squeezed my shoulder and said, "Son, it's already happening. We've got deputies on the way to the nursing home in Florida where Roy has been living under the name Ray Collins since 1998, thinking we'd never find him, but Grandma made sure we would, and when they read him his rights tomorrow morning, he's gonna learn that a 74-year-old barefoot woman in a blizzard was stronger than he ever was." But the biggest shock was still coming, because when the FBI started tracing Paulson's old church camp photos, they found one picture taken in 1966 showing Reverend Paulson with his arm around a skinny 12-year-old boy who looked familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, and when they enhanced it and ran facial recognition, the boy turned out to be someone the whole country already knew, someone who became famous for preaching family values on television every Sunday morning for the last 30 years. And Grandma had written on the back of that photo in red ink, "If anything happens to me, make sure this boy pays too." And that name is the reason the FBI sealed the entire case file and slapped a national security gag order on all of us overnight, because what Grandma buried wasn't just a small-town horror story. It was about to bring down one of the most powerful megachurch televangelists in America, and the fallout was going to be on every channel from CNN to Fox News before the week was out. And that's where part 4 starts, because the morning the U.S. Marshals kicked in the door of that televangelist's mansion in Nashville, the first thing they found in his safe was an envelope addressed to Evelyn Mae Carter, postmarked the week before she died, and inside was a cashier's check for $250,000 with the words, "For your silence one last time," written in the memo line. The morning of September 28, 2012, I was sitting in the Clover Valley Sheriff's office drinking the worst coffee I'd ever tasted when Sheriff Dan Olson walked in with 2 U.S. Marshals wearing windbreakers that said Federal Task Force, and one of them laid a photograph on the table face down and said, "Mr. Carter, before we flip this over, you need to understand that what you're about to see cannot leave this room until the Attorney General himself lifts the gag order, because the man in this picture has preached to 40 million Americans every Sunday for 30 years, and if this leaks early, there will be riots in half the churches in the country." And I just stared at him, because I already knew whose face was on the other side. I had seen that fake smile on billboards and on the Trinity Broadcasting network since I was a teenager, and when the marshal flipped the photo over there, he was 12-year-old Billy Ray Hammond clinging to Reverend Paulson's side at church camp 1966 with the same frightened eyes my daddy had in those basement Polaroids. Only Billy Ray grew up to become Dr. William R. Hammond, the man who wrote 30 best-selling books on family values, who had the ear of presidents, who told millions of grandmas every week that spanking children builds character and that wives must submit and that God hates weakness. And Grandma had written across the bottom in red ink, "He learned from the same devil. Make him confess or I will from the grave, EMC." The marshal said the envelope we found in his Nashville safe contained a cashier's check for $250,000 made out to Evelyn M. Carter dated December 18, 1978, 6 days before she died, and on the stub in Hammond's own handwriting it said final payment for silence regarding Clover Valley 1953 to 1972, and when they searched the rest of the safe they found a second reel-to-reel tape labeled Evelyn Threats Christmas 1978, and when the tech played it in a soundproof room the first voice you hear is Grandma's weak and frostbitten but strong as steel saying, "Billy Ray Hammond, if you ever want to preach again you will wire me the money you owe me for keeping your filthy secret all these years, because I have every picture, every tape, every lock of hair, and the day I die it all goes to my grandson and the newspapers, and you will finally burn for what you let Paulson do to my little Roy and to all those other boys." And then you hear Hammond laughing that fake preacher laugh, saying, "Old woman, you'll be dead before the ground thaws, and nobody will ever believe a drunk's crazy mother over a man of God." And Grandma answered him back clear as a church bell, "Then watch me rise from the grave, Billy Ray, because I have already made sure the truth will outlive both of us." And the tape ends with the sound of her hanging up the phone on him. I sat there listening to my 74-year-old grandma scare a multimillion-dollar televangelist with nothing but a payphone and pure courage while she was freezing to death, and I started crying so hard the marshal had to hand me a box of tissues, and Sheriff Olson said, "Tommy, your grandma wasn't just protecting you, she was protecting every kid that monster ever looked at sideways, and she played the long game for 34 years from beyond the grave." By noon the news helicopters were circling the little White House because somebody leaked that the FBI had seized boxes from Dr. William R. Hammond's ministry, and social media was already exploding with people saying it was fake news, Satan attacking a good man. But then the U.S. attorney held a press conference and showed one redacted Polaroid, just one of a naked frightened child with Paulson's hand on his shoulder, and the whole country went dead silent for about 6 hours, and then the floodgates opened. Men in their 50s, 60s, 70s started calling tip lines saying, "Me too, I was an altar boy at Clover Valley Lutheran. Me too, I went to camp with Reverend Paulson. Me too, he took me for a ride in his Buick." And the switchboard at the FBI field office crashed twice before supper. That same afternoon they brought Daddy Roy in from the Florida nursing home where he had been hiding, calling himself Ray Collins, playing shuffleboard and telling everybody his family died in a car wreck. And when the deputies walked in reading the murder warrant for Harold Carter, he looked up with those same devil eyes I remembered from Christmas Eve and said, "You got the wrong man, I don't even know those people anymore." And the deputy just slapped Grandma's letter and the bloody thumbprint on the table and said, "Evelyn says hello, Roy." And for the first time in my life I heard my father cry like the little boy he used to be before Paulson got him, and he whispered, "Mama knew the whole time and I killed my own daddy for nothing." They put him in the county jail awaiting extradition, and the next morning the public defender showed up with a deal offer: murder to 15 years because Roy was 71 and sick. But I told the prosecutor, "No ma'am, you give him life with no parole because Grandma waited 34 frozen years for this, and 15 is an insult." So they revoked the deal and scheduled trial for the spring, and the prosecutor said, "Tommy, we're also charging him with felony abuse for what he did to your mama and to you." And I said, "Add attempted murder of Evelyn Mae Carter, because locking a 74-year-old woman outside barefoot at 50 below is attempted murder." And she smiled for the first time all week and said, "Consider it done." But the real storm was just starting, because Hammond's lawyers tried to say the tapes and pictures were forged by a bitter ex-employees, and then on live television during his nightly broadcast he looked straight into the camera with tears in his eyes and told 60 million viewers that he was the real victim of a vast leftist conspiracy, and within minutes his followers started sending death threats to my phone, to Sheriff Olson, to Mrs. Erickson, who still owned Grandma's house, and one envelope Even showed up with a dead rat inside and a note that said stop lying about a man of God or Clover Valley will burn again. And that night somebody threw a brick through the window of the little white house with the word whore painted on it in red, and I realized Grandma had been right about one more thing: evil doesn't die easy, it just puts on a suit and a smile and calls itself family values. The FBI moved me to a safe house in Duluth, and that's where I spent the next 3 weeks watching the whole country argue about whether a famous preacher could possibly be guilty, while I held Grandma's wedding ring on my pinky and whispered to her every single night, "I'm not backing down either." And then on October 19th everything changed again, because a retired Minnesota state trooper walked into the FBI office carrying a grocery bag and said, "I've been waiting 40 years to do this," and inside the bag were 37 cassette tapes labeled with boys' names and dates from 1970 to 1982, and he said Reverend Paulson paid me $500 a month from 1975 until he died to keep these locked in my attic because he was too paranoid to keep them himself. And the agent who took the bag said, "Sir, do you realize what you just did?" And the old trooper looked him dead in the eye and said, "I was one of those boys too, and Evelyn Carter was the only adult who ever tried to help me, and I promised her on the day of her funeral that if the truth ever came out I would bring the rest of it, and now I'm here." And that mountain of new evidence is what finally forced Dr. William R. Hammond to cancel his television show and disappear behind the gates of his compound. But Grandma still had one last card to play, because the very last item in that grocery bag was a sealed envelope addressed to me, Tommy Carter, in the trooper's handwriting, with a note that said, "Your grandma gave me this the week she died and told me only to deliver it if the big fish ever got caught." And when I opened it there was a single key on a red ribbon and a tiny map drawn on the back of a 1978 church bulletin pointing to a spot behind the Clover Valley Lutheran altar with the words, "He thinks I forgot, but I never did." And that's where part 5 begins, because the morning we took a jackhammer to the church foundation we found a steel box soldered shut, and inside were the original negatives of every Polaroid, plus a ledger listing payoffs to parents, to police, to even a judge. And the very last entry, dated December 23, 1978, read, "Paid E. Carter final $250,000 or she talks," and right under it in different ink someone had written, "She died anyway, problem solved." And that handwriting belonged to the man who is now the senior senator from Tennessee. The jackhammer started at 7:30 in the morning on a freezing October Tuesday, and by 8 o'clock the whole town of Clover Valley was standing outside the little white-steepled Lutheran church in parkas and scarves, watching FBI agents in Tyvek suits carry out a rusted steel box the size of a footlocker, while the new pastor, a young woman fresh out of seminary, stood on the steps crying because she had no idea what had been buried under her altar for 44 years. And when they pried that box open in the evidence tent, the first thing that fell out was a marble-covered ledger, the kind stores used in the 60s, and on the very last page in neat fountain pen ink was the entry, December 23, 1978, paid E. Carter final $250,000 cash or she talks. And then in different ink, almost scratched into the paper, someone had added, "She died anyway, problem solved." And the handwriting expert flew in from Quantico that same afternoon and confirmed the second line belonged to Tennessee senior United States Senator Benjamin T. Hargrove, who just happened to be the junior pastor at Clover Valley Lutheran from 1976 to 1982, who just happened to be the one who preached Grandma Evelyn's funeral sermon, who stood at her graveside in his black robe and told the whole town what a gentle, godly woman she was, while his own fingers were still dirty from helping bury the evidence that would have ended his career before it started. By noon the senator's office released a statement saying he was shocked at the allegations and was praying for all parties and would fully cooperate, but by 3 o'clock his chief of staff was on every network calling it a hoax cooked up by radical leftists, and by 5 o'clock the FBI had a warrant and they kicked in the door of his mansion outside Nashville and found a burner phone in his bedroom dresser with only one number in the call. Log Grandma Evelyn's old rotary phone number. Called exactly once on December 24, 1978 at 6:47 p.m., the exact hour she was walking home barefoot through the blizzard, and when they pulled the cell tower records that burner phone was pinging off the tower right here in Clover Valley the night she died, and the senator was supposed to be in Washington voting on a defense bill, but his private jet log shows he flew into Duluth that morning and back out at midnight, and the rental car he used was returned with 214 miles on it, the exact round trip distance from Duluth Airport to Clover Valley and back. I watched all of this on the Safehouse television with my mouth open because the boy in those Polaroids, the one who grew up to wear $3,000 suits and wave a Bible on the Senate floor, was the same man who confirmed me when I was 14, who put his hand on my head and told me to be a soldier for Christ while his other hand was still carrying the smell of Grandma's blood from helping Roy cover everything up, and the FBI agent sitting next to me said, "Mr. Carter, we are now looking at a conspiracy that reaches the United States Senate and possibly higher, and your grandmother is the only reason any of this is seeing daylight." That night I couldn't sleep, so I walked down to the shores of Lake Superior and I threw rocks into the black water and I screamed at the stars, "Why didn't you just tell somebody, Grandma? Why did you carry this alone for so long?" And the wind off the lake sounded exactly like her soft laugh, and I swear I heard her whisper, "Because they would have killed you too, baby," and I had to protect my little Tommy until he was big enough to finish it, and I fell on my knees in the sand and cried until I thought my ribs would crack, because she had played chess with the devil for 34 years and she won. The next morning the arrests started coming fast. Roy was flown back from Florida in shackles, and the second he saw me through the jail glass he started sobbing, "Mama, I'm sorry Mama, I didn't mean to hurt her, I was scared," and I told him through the phone, "You can be sorry to her when you meet her again, because I'm testifying to everything," and he just put his head on the counter and cried like the 4-year-old boy in those pictures. Then Senator Hargrove's chief of staff flipped within 6 hours and took a plea deal and started singing about weekly cash drops in a safe in the church basement, payoffs to 2 different county sheriffs back in the day, and a retirement fund in the Cayman Islands that still had $12 million in it, with deposits going all the way to 2009, and every deposit was labeled tithes from grateful families, and the FBI said that was code for hush money to parents who took the cash and told their little boys to keep quiet, and the list of names in that ledger read like a who's who of Minnesota and Tennessee power going back 3 generations: judges, doctors, mill owners, even the man who was now the governor's chief of staff, and Grandma had watched them all sit in her pews every Sunday after Sunday smiling and singing hymns while their children carried scars no hymn could heal. By the end of the week the church was padlocked, the steeple cross taken down, the congregation scattered, some defending the pastors, some weeping in the parking lot saying we had no idea, and the new young pastor asked me if she could hold a healing service in the gym of the elementary school, and over 300 people showed up: victims, family members, townspeople, and I stood up with Grandma's wedding ring on my pinky and I read her letter out loud, every word, and when I got to the part where she said kindness is stronger than meanness, every single time people started standing room only started clapping and crying, and a man in the back who I recognized as my old Little League coach stood up and said I was one of Paulson's boys too, and Evelyn tried to help me when I was 9 and my daddy beat me for telling, so thank you Tommy for finishing what she started. And one by one 27 men stood up that night and said me too, and the young pastor just opened her arms and we all held each other while the news cameras stayed outside because this moment belonged to us. But the biggest earthquake was still coming because when the forensic accountants followed the money trail from the Cayman account, they found quarterly wire transfers starting in 1985 going to a charity in Dallas called the Shepherd's Lamb Foundation, and the registered agent for that foundation was none other than Dr. William R. Hammond himself, and the money wasn't for orphans, it was paying for private islands, soundproof cabins, and a string of boys from South America with no passports. And when the FBI raided the foundation offices, they found a wall safe with a list of 28 current United States congressmen and senators who had visited those islands, and the Attorney General held a closed-door briefing and then quietly resigned the next day, and the new Attorney General flew to Clover Valley herself and stood on the courthouse steps and told the only words she said to the cameras were, "Justice delayed is still justice, and we will not stop until every name on that list answers for what they did." And the entire country lost its mind for about 4 days straight. And in the middle of all this chaos, a little brown envelope arrived at the safe house with no return address, and inside was a single brass key and a note in handwriting I didn't recognize that said, "Check the confessional booth left knee panel and come alone." And when I did what it said, I found a final cassette tape labeled Tommy's Inheritance. Play loud. Love, GMA. And when I took it to the FBI tech and we played it in the evidence room, it was Grandma's voice, clear as the day she recorded it the night she died, saying, "My sweet brave boy, if you're hearing this, then the monsters are finally falling, and there's one last thing I saved for you alone, because money from the devil can still do God's work. Turn it into." A voice crackled, and then she laughed that soft bell laugh and said, "The Cayman account number and the password is Tommy Kindheart, and every penny in there now belongs to you to build something beautiful for children who have no one, just like I always wanted to do and tell the world. I'm proud of you, and I'll be waiting under the tomato plants when you're ready to come home." And that's where part 6 begins, because when we logged into that account there wasn't $12 million anymore, there was $47 million, and the last deposit was made the day before Hammond was arrested with the memo line for Evelyn. She won after all, and the FBI said, "It's yours, Tommy, every cent," because the courts already seized everything else those men owned, and Grandma had outplayed them from the grave one final time. $47 million. I sat in the Duluth Federal Building staring at the computer screen with the FBI forensic accountant and the U.S. Attorney herself, and the numbers didn't even look real, just a long string of zeros after zeros with my name listed as sole beneficiary because Grandma had opened that Cayman account in 1985 using a trust in my name with a post office box in International Falls, and every time one of those monsters sent another hush money deposit, the bank automatically forwarded the confirmation slip to a storage unit in Grandma's maiden name, and she had been doing it for 37 years while she lived on a $300 a month pension and grew tomatoes in the same dirt that hid Grandpa Harold's bones. And when the attorney asked me what I wanted to do with the money, I didn't even have to think. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Every single penny goes to the children they hurt and the ones still being hurt, and I want it loud, I want it public, and I want the world to know it." Came from a 74-year-old barefoot woman who beat them all, and the attorney smiled for the first time since I met her and said, "Mr. Carter, consider it done." And within 48 hours the Department of Justice issued a press release announcing the creation of the Evelyn Mae Carter Children's Justice Foundation with an initial endowment of $47 million seized from the Clover Valley predator ring, and the headline on every major network that night was the same: Grandma frozen. In 1978 delivers largest child protection gift in U.S. history from beyond the grave, and my phone started ringing so hard the FBI had to give me a new number because grandmothers from California to Maine were calling the switchboard crying and wanting to add their own $5, $10, $20, whatever they could spare, because they said Evelyn sounds like my mama and we want to help too. And by the end of the first week, ordinary people had donated another $4 million in envelopes addressed to Tommy Carter, care of Grandma. Evelyn and the foundation accountant had to rent a bigger office just to open the mail. Daddy Roy watched the news from his jail cell, and when the guard told him the money that was supposed to buy silence was now building safe houses for abused kids, he asked for a meeting with me, and I went because Grandma would have wanted me to. And when they brought him into the visitation room in his orange jumpsuit, he looked 90 instead of 71, and the first thing he said was I hated her for making me soft, but she was right all along. And I whispered back, she never stopped loving you, Roy, even after everything. And he put his head down on the metal table and cried so hard the guard had to bring him tissues, and he signed the plea deal that same afternoon: life without parole for Harold's murder plus 40 years consecutive for what he did to Mama and to Grandma and to me. And the judge sealed it with no appeal because the prosecutor played the 911 call from Christmas morning 1978 that nobody knew existed, the neighbor who saw Grandma walking barefoot and called the sheriff, but the old sheriff back then was on Paulson's payroll and buried the tape. And when they pulled it out of archives, my 8-year-old voice is screaming on the recording, she's barefoot, Daddy through her boots, please help Grandma. And you hear Daddy in the background yelling, hang up that phone, boy, or I'll give you something to cry about. And the whole courtroom was silent except for grown men sobbing when it finished. Senator Hargrove tried to flee to the Caymans on his private jet, but customs agents were waiting on the tarmac because the foundation had posted a $10 million reward for information leading to his arrest, and the flight attendant who had been paid to keep quiet for 30 years took the money and made the call, and he was arrested in his silk pajamas before he could even taxi. And when they searched the plane, they found 2 terrified teenagers from Honduras hidden in the back, and that image. The senator in handcuffs with those boys behind him ended his career in 30 seconds flat. Dr. William R. Hammond lasted exactly 9 more days. He locked himself in his Nashville compound with a pistol and a bottle of Jack Daniels, and on the 10th morning his housekeeper found him in the prayer chapel with a gun in his mouth and a suicide note that simply read, she won. And the medical examiner said he had written Evelyn Mae Carter on the wall in his own blood before he pulled the trigger, and the headline screamed, televangelist takes own life as Grandma's revenge goes viral, and the foundation donations hit 20 million more overnight because people said if a 74-year-old woman can bring down an empire barefoot in a blizzard, then maybe there really is a God. I flew back to Clover Valley for the first board meeting of the Evelyn Mae Carter Foundation, and we held it right in the elementary school gym where the healing service had happened, and over 600 people showed up: victims, supporters, reporters, and little old ladies in purple hats carrying casserole dishes. And when I walked to the microphone with Grandma's wedding ring on my pinky, the whole room stood up and clapped until their hands bled. And I told them, we are buying the old church property, tearing down that poison building, and on that exact spot we are building the Evelyn Mae Carter Safe Village. 60 cottages, a school, a therapy center, a medical clinic, and a garden where every child plants tomatoes in the spring because Grandma always said love grows where tomatoes grow. And the first shovel of dirt was turned by the 92-year-old retired trooper who brought the final tapes, and he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, your grandma saved my life twice, once when I was 9 and she gave me a butterscotch and told me it wasn't my fault, and again the day you opened that floorboard. We opened the Safe Village on December 24th, 2014. Exactly 36 years to the day Grandma walked home barefoot, and I stood at the dedication with 500 survivors and their families and a choir of children who had found safety because of what she did, and we unveiled a life-size bronze statue of a tiny barefoot grandmother in a coat holding a red gift box with the inscription "She froze so we could be warm," and when the cloth dropped, every news camera in the country was there and people started sobbing on live television, and the clip went so viral YouTube had to add extra servers, and the foundation account topped $100 million by New Year's because strangers kept mailing nickels, dimes, quarters with little notes that said "For Evelyn." But Grandma still had one final miracle waiting, because in the spring of 2015, when the construction crew was putting in the playground, they hit something metal under the exact spot where her tomato garden used to be, and when they dug it up it was another oilskin packet, and inside was a single silver baby spoon, the one I used when I was little, and a note in her handwriting that said, "My dearest Tommy, the day you read this, you will have done what I could only dream, plant something beautiful where they planted pain, and I am so proud I could burst. Keep the spoon, and remember, every child you feed with it is me kissing your cheek." And I dropped to my knees right there in the dirt holding that spoon while the workmen cried with me, and we poured the concrete for the playground around that spot and set the spoon in the center so every kid who swings or slides is standing on Grandma's love. Roy died in prison in 2017 of cancer and asked to be buried next to Grandma, and I said yes because she would have wanted forgiveness even if I couldn't give it. And on the day we laid him in the ground, I put a single red poinsettia on his casket and whispered, "She still loves you, Daddy, and I hope you finally feel it now." The Safe Village is 10 years old this Christmas Eve, and over 14,000 children have slept safe under its roofs, and every year on December 24th we light 14,000 luminaries along the driveway, and the statue of Grandma glows in the snow that we pray never falls hard enough to hurt anybody again. And I still wear her wedding ring on my pinky, and every single night I walk through the cottages and I whisper the same words she whispered to me through that frosted window all those years ago: "Be brave, kindness is stronger than meanness," every single time. But there are 4 more parts to this story, because Grandma left 4 more boxes buried in 4 different states, each one tied to a different name on that ledger, and each one waiting for the day those men thought they were safe. And the next box is in a cornfield in Iowa under a scarecrow that has been standing guard since 1981, and the farmer who owns the land just called me last week and said the crows won't come near it anymore, and something metal is shining through the dirt. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October 2023 while I was in the Safe Village kitchen helping the kids frost pumpkin cookies, and the number on my phone was an Iowa area code I didn't know, so I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut said answer it, and when I did, an old man's voice cracked across the line and said, "Is this Tommy Carter, the one with the Grandma statue?" And I said, "Yes sir, this is Tommy," and he got real quiet and then whispered, "My name is Vernon Detweiler. I own the farm on Route 12 outside Cedar Rapids, and ever since your grandma's story went nationwide, the crows stopped landing on my Northfield scarecrow, and yesterday my grandson was out there fixing fence, and he saw something silver glinting under the straw, and when we pulled the shirt off the crosspiece there was a rusted metal box zip-tied to the wooden spine with a hanging tag that says, "For Tommy when the crows leave. Love, GMA December 24th, 78." And I dropped the frosting knife right there on the tile floor because Grandma had been dead 45 years and she was still talking to me from under the ground in states I'd never even visited. I flew to Cedar Rapids that same afternoon, and Vernon met me at the gate in his overalls and a John Deere cap, looking 90 but moving like 70, and he didn't say much on the drive, just kept glancing at me like I was a ghost until we pulled up to the farm, and there it was, the scarecrow standing alone in the middle of a picked clean cornfield, arms outstretched, shirt flapping in the wind, and the crow circling high overhead but never landing, and when we walked out there the dirt around the post had been scratched up like something had been digging, and the metal box was half exposed, glinting dully in the sun. And Vernon handed me a pocketknife and said, "Your grandma mailed me a letter the week she died, told me to put this box here and nail it to the scarecrow, and if anybody ever tried to move it I was to shoot first and ask questions later, and I've been guarding it with my 12 gauge for 45 years, but the crows know when it's time. And they left yesterday, so it's yours now, son." I cut the zip ties, and the box was heavier than the others, and when I opened it right there in the stubble, the first thing that fell out was a brass key on the same red ribbon as the church key, and a cassette tape labeled Iowa 1961. Play in daylight only, and then a thick manila envelope sealed with wax, and on the wax was pressed Grandma's wedding ring, the same one I wore every day, and I broke that seal with shaking fingers, and inside were 63 birth certificates of babies born at the Clover Valley Lutheran Hospital between 1958 and 1965, all boys, all listed as stillborn, all with the same attending physician Reverend Ezekiel Paulson and the same nurse Evelyn M. Carter, and every single certificate had a tiny red X in the corner and a Polaroid paper clipped to it showing a newborn wrapped in a blue blanket, and in Grandma's handwriting on the back of each photo for the adoption fee $10,000 cash paid to Reverend Paulson, and then the real parents' names crossed out and new names written in different ink. Wealthy childless couples from Chicago, Des Moines, Minneapolis, and even one from Beverly Hills, California, and at the bottom of the stack was a ledger matching every baby to every payment amount, date, and the new adoptive parents, and the total came to $630,000 in 1960s money, every penny run through the church building fund and labeled new steeple donation. Vernon had to sit down on the ground because his legs gave out, and he whispered, "My wife lost a baby boy in 1961, said he was stillborn, but I always wondered why they wouldn't let us see him." And I looked at him and said, "Vernon, show me your wife's maiden name," and he told me, and I flipped through the stack, and there it was, baby boy Detweiler, born June 12. 1961, 8 pounds 3 ounces, red X, paid in full by Mr. and Mrs. Langford, Chicago, and the Polaroid showed a perfect healthy newborn. And Vernon started crying so hard he couldn't breathe, and I held that old farmer in the corn stubble while he met his son for the first time at 88 years old, and the scarecrow just stood there watching like Grandma planned the whole reunion. We took the box to the Iowa Attorney General the next morning, and within a week 63 living men, average age 62, started getting knocks on their doors from detectives with envelopes that said you were not stillborn, you were sold, and every single one of them had the same story, raised by wealthy parents who could never quite look them in the eye, always told they were adopted but never the details. And when we did the DNA matches through the Foundation's Victim Fund, 59 of the 63 men matched living mothers who had been told their babies died, and the 4 who didn't match were fathers who had raped girls in Paulson's youth group and paid to make the problem disappear. And the state of Iowa opened the largest illegal adoption investigation in American history, and the newspapers called it Grandma Evelyn's Army, because every time another box surfaced, another piece of Paulson's empire crumbled. Vernon's son flew in from California, the man who had been raised as Jonathan Langford, CEO of a tech company worth billions, and when he hugged his real daddy for the first time in that cornfield, both of them sobbing on my shoulders, I heard Grandma's bell laugh in the wind again. And Jonathan wrote the foundation a check for $50 million the next day with a note that said, "For my real mother, whoever she is, and for the grandmother who gave me back my father." But the deepest cut was still inside that Iowa box, because under the birth certificates wrapped in oilskin was a second cassette tape labeled "Play Last," and when we put it in the machine in a quiet room, it was Grandma's voice again, thin and tired but fierce, saying, "Tommy, if you found Iowa, then you know what they did to the babies, and there are 3 more states left: Nebraska, South Dakota, and Illinois, each one with a scarecrow or a birdhouse or a hollow tree and each one holding a different kind of hell, and when you finish all four you will have broken every chain Paulson ever forged. But be careful, because one of the men who paid for those babies grew up to be the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and he will fight you with every ounce of power he has, because his real mother was a 15-year-old girl from Duluth who Paulson drove to the hospital himself and told her the baby was dead, and that man has spent 70 years trying to forget where he came from, and he is terrified of you right now. And that's where part 8 begins, because 2 weeks after the Iowa box hit the news, a black Suburban with government plates pulled up to the Safe Village gates, and a woman in a Navy suit stepped out holding a sealed federal envelope and said, "Mr. Carter, the Chief Justice requests a private meeting, no cameras, no recording, and he is willing to resign quietly if you will bury the Illinois box unopened." But I looked at that bronze statue of Grandma barefoot holding her red gift, and I said, "Tell him Evelyn Mae Carter already made her decision 47 years ago, and the meeting is happening in public on national television, or it isn't happening at all." The envelope from the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court sat unopened on my desk for exactly 6 minutes before I walked it out to the Safe Village dining hall and laid it on the table in front of 60 former stillborn men from Iowa and their mothers who had come for the first reunion, and I said, "This is from the highest judge in the land asking me to bury the last box so his name never comes out," and every single one of those silver-haired men looked at me with the same fire I felt in my chest, and the oldest one, 81-year-old Martin Lindstrom, who found out 6 months ago he'd been sold for $12,000 in 1959, stood up and said, "Tell the Chief Justice that 63 grandmas froze barefoot so we could know the truth, and we're not going back in the ground for anybody," and the room erupted in cheers and tears, and I knew right then Grandma had already won again. I called the woman in the Navy suit back and told her the meeting would be in the Safe Village Chapel, livestreamed to every major network at noon on Christmas Eve, exactly 47 years to the day Grandma walked home barefoot, and the Chief Justice could either show up and confess on camera, or we would dig up the Illinois box on Christmas morning and let the chips fall. And she was quiet so long I thought the line went dead, and then she whispered, "He will be there," and hung up. The world stopped spinning for the next 10 days. Cable news counted down the hours like it was New Year's Eve. Facebook groups with millions of members changed their banners to a silhouette of Grandma barefoot holding the red gift, and the hashtag barefoot on Christmas went to #1 worldwide, and donations to the foundation passed $300 million because people kept saying, if a 74-year-old woman can make the Supreme Court blink, then maybe there really is justice after all. Christmas Eve morning 2024 dawned clear and cold in northern Minnesota, 22 below zero, just like 1978, and at 11:55 a.m. a motorcade of black Suburbans rolled through the Safe Village gates, and out stepped Chief Justice Malcolm J. Whitmore in his long overcoat, looking every day of his 70 years with Secret Service on every side and back, and he walked straight up to the bronze statue of Grandma, touched her bare feet with a gloved hand, and started crying on live television before he ever reached the chapel door. Inside we had set up one long table on the stage, me on one side, 63 adopted sons and their birth mothers on the other, and one empty chair for the Chief Justice, and when he sat down the only sound in the whole world was cameras clicking and Grandma's breathing, and he looked straight into the lens and said, "My name is Malcolm James Whitmore, and on March 3, 1954 I was born Malcolm James Olson to 15-year-old Anna Marie Olson of Duluth, Minnesota, and I was told I died at birth, but Reverend Ezekiel Paulson sold me for $15,000 to federal judge Harold Whitmore and his wife who could not have children, and I have spent 70 years trying to outrun the shame of where I came from, and today I am here to confess that shame belongs to the men who sold me, not to me and not to my mother." And then he turned to Anna Marie, who was sitting in the front row, now 85 years old, in a purple coat, and he walked down the steps and knelt in front of her and said, "Mama, I'm sorry I never came to find you," and she opened her arms, and the same way Grandma would have, and the whole chapel lost it. Grown men, Secret Service agents, camera operators, everybody sobbing, while the Chief Justice of the United States cried in his real mother's lap like the baby boy he never got to be. Then he stood up, wiped his face, and said, "Effective noon today, I am resigning from the Supreme Court, and I am turning over every document, every diary, every canceled check my adoptive father kept to the Department of Justice, because the illegal adoption ring reached into courtrooms, law firms, and statehouses across this country, and I will testify against every living person who knew." And the president accepted the resignation 20 minutes later and appointed the first Native American woman to the court before the sun went down that same day. But Grandma had one last swing left in her, because when the Chief Justice's staff opened his personal safe to inventory it for the investigators, they found a final oilskin packet addressed to Tommy Carter in Grandma's handwriting that had been sitting there since 1979, with a note on the outside that said, "Only open if Malcolm finds his courage," and inside was the original hospital bracelet from March 3, 1954, reading "Baby Boy Olson," and a lock of black baby hair, and a second cassette tape labeled for Malcolm. And when we played it in the chapel with him sitting right there, it was Grandma's voice, soft and tired, from that payphone, Christmas Eve 1978, saying, "Malcolm James, if you are hearing this, then you finally know you were loved from the first breath you ever took, and the woman who carried you never stopped lighting a candle for you every single Sunday for 70 years, and I want you to stop running now. Baby boy, come home to Minnesota and let Anna Marie hold you, because a mother's arms are stronger than any robe you will ever wear." And the Chief Justice just laid his head on the table and wept while the whole world watched, and the clip of that moment broke the internet for 3 straight days. That night, after the motorcade left, I walked out to Grandma's statue with a lantern, and the snow was falling soft like it was apologizing for 1978, and I brushed the flakes off her bronze feet, and I said out loud, "We did it, Grandma, every last one of them fell," and she set them up like dominoes from the grave, and the wind answered with her bell laugh again, and I swear the red gift box in her bronze hands glowed for just a second. The foundation used the Chief Justice's family money plus the hundreds of millions in new donations to buy 3 more campuses in Nebraska, South Dakota, and Illinois on the exact spots where the last 3 boxes are buried, and we are turning them into Safe Village 2, 3, and 4, so every stolen baby will have a place to come home to, and every mother who was told her child died will have a garden to plant tomatoes in. And remember, love grows where tomatoes grow. And there is only one state left, one final box still waiting under a hollow tree in South Dakota, 1981, the one Grandma marked on her master map with a black X, and the words, "Worst of all, do not open alone." And the farmer who owns that land just called yesterday and said the tree split in the last storm and something metal is shining inside, and the crows won't even fly over it anymore. I flew into Rapid City on a red-eye the first week of November 2025 with a knot in my stomach I hadn't felt since the morning we dug up Grandpa Harold, because the map Grandma drew in 1978 on the back of a South Dakota road atlas had only one spot circled in black ink, and the words "Worst of all, do not open alone" written so hard the pen tore the paper, and every person I told me not to go, the FBI, the U.S. attorney, even the new Supreme Court Justice who used to be Chief Justice Whitmore, all begged me to let a tactical team handle it, but I told them, no ma'am, this is between me and Grandma, and if she wrote do not open alone, then I'm bringing the only people whose hearts she already trusted. So I called the 63 Iowa sons and Vernon Detweiler and Anna Marie and every survivor who wanted to come, and 72 of us rented 3 charter buses and drove out to the Black Hills to a lonely cottonwood tree on the Pine Ridge Reservation that had split clean down the middle in a windstorm the week before, and there in the hollow heart of that tree was the last metal box painted Lakota red with a medicine wheel on the lid and a note wired to it that said, "For the children who never came home, play the tape first, love GMA." An elder from the Oglala Sioux tribe named Leonard Little Hawk met us there with sweetgrass and cedar burning in an abalone shell, and he told us his own grandmother had helped Evelyn hide this box in 1981 after she drove all night from Minnesota with it strapped in the passenger seat of her old Buick, and she paid Leonard's grandmother $50 and a jar of homemade chokecherry jelly to keep the secret until the tree itself told us it was time, and the split trunk was the sign. So Leonard sang a protection song while we lifted the box out, and every crow for 50 miles stayed silent like the sky itself was holding its breath. We carried the box to the tribal community center and set it on a blanket of star quilts, and when we opened it, the smell that came out made even the FBI agents step back, because it was old blood and formaldehyde and something sweet like baby powder, and the first thing on top was another reel-to-reel tape labeled "Play Loud" all the way through. And no matter what you hear, and a handwritten sign-off in Grandma's handwriting that said, "Tommy, this one is the reason I could never rest." They took the little ones who looked Lakota and called them orphans and sold them to white families overseas, and some never made it past the first winter, and I swore on Harold's grave I would bring them home. So when you hear the tape you will know why I stayed alive as long as I did. We threaded that ancient tape on the only working reel-to-reel in 3 counties, and when we hit play the room filled with the sound of babies crying, dozens, maybe hundreds of tiny voices, and then a man's voice, calm and cruel, the same voice from the earlier tapes, Reverend Paulson, saying, "Batch of 12 ready for Rotterdam shipment January 1964, ages 6 weeks to 14 months, all full blood or close enough, parents terminated rights or deceased." And then you hear a woman crying in Lakota begging, "Don't take my baby, please," and Paulson laughing, telling her the church will give her a nice blanket for her trouble, and the tape rolls on like that for 47 minutes, listing dates, ships, captains, dollar amounts, ports in Holland, Belgium, Canada, and every single child marked healthy or delicate or difficult, and at the very end you hear Grandma's voice suddenly on the recording, younger, stronger, furious, saying, "You will burn for this, Ezekiel Paulson. I have every name, every grave, every ship manifest, and one day the grandmothers will rise and drag you into the light." And the tape ends with the sound of a car door slamming and tires spinning on gravel, like she recorded it secretly from inside the church office, and then drove straight to the reservation to hide the proof. Leonard Little Hawk had to sit down because his own aunt had disappeared from the church boarding school in 1963 when she was 3 months old, and the tribal president took one look at the ledger that was under the tape and whispered, "We always knew, but we had no proof," and now the proof has come home on the wind, and the ledger listed 211 Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota infants taken between 1959 and 1972, labeled church adoptions, but shipped to Europe and sold for $25,000 each to families in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, and beside every name was a tiny handprint in red ink and the word "alive" or "deceased," and the deceased column had 118 names with little crosses, and the dates they died on the voyage or in the first year, and Grandma had written across the bottom in red, "I will meet them at the river and tell them their mothers never stopped singing." The room was silent except for crying, and then Leonard stood up and said, "We ride at dawn to bring our children home," and within 24 hours the Lakota Nation declared a day of mourning and healing, and the foundation wired $20 million to begin DNA testing and repatriation, and the German government issued a formal apology on television and opened sealed church archives and shipping records, and the Dutch parliament did the same, and families started coming forward, white families who had always wondered why their adopted child looked native and why the paperwork never quite added up, and within 6 months 109 living souls flew home on chartered planes paid for by the foundation, and the remains of the 118 who didn't survive were brought back in tiny white coffins wrapped in star quilts, and we buried them in a circle around a new medicine wheel on safe village land, with every tribe in the Dakotas singing them home, and the last little coffin belonged to Leonard Little Hawk's aunt, and when they lowered her home after 62 years he looked at me and said, "Tell Evelyn the circle is closed and the grandmother's won." But Grandma had buried one final thing in that red box, a single envelope addressed to the President of the United States with a wax seal using her wedding ring again, and inside was a list of 11 current and former world leaders from 4 countries who had knowingly purchased stolen native children through Paulson's pipeline, and the note attached said, "Mr. President, some debts are bigger than nations and the grandmothers are tired of waiting." And 3 weeks later the White House announced a global task force on historical child trafficking, and the first arrest was a former Belgian prime minister who is now 91, and the second was a Dutch shipping heiress worth billions, and the third was a man who had been knighted by the Queen of England, and every single one of them cried on camera and said, "I didn't know when the DNA results came back positive." The world changed that year. Laws were passed, money was paid, hearts were broken open and healed, and the Evelyn Mae Carter Foundation topped $1 billion in assets because people said, if one barefoot grandma can fix a century of wrong, then we can at least send $20, and every child who came home planted a tomato plant in the new garden at Safe Village West on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and every spring came early the year the last child came home. And there is only one part left, because Grandma left one final instruction on the very last page of the South Dakota Ledger, written in her shaky 1978 hand. It says, "When every child is home and every monster has fallen, take the red ribbon from every key, tie them together into one long cord, and hang it on the statue's hand on Christmas Eve 2025, because that is the night love finally won and the circle will be complete." Christmas Eve 2025, 47 years to the minute since Grandma Evelyn Mae Carter walked home barefoot through the blizzard. The temperature outside the safe village dropped to 24 below zero, exactly the same as that night in 1978, and the snow fell soft and silent, like the sky itself was laying a quilt over the world, and every cottage, every garden, every path was lined with 47,000 luminaries, one for every year she waited, and the bronze statue of Grandma stood in the center of the village circle, barefoot, coat open, red gift box in her hands. Only tonight that little box was glowing because we had wrapped it in 10,000 tiny white Christmas lights, and the glow lit up her gentle smile so bright you could see it from the highway. At 6:47 p.m., the exact minute Grandma's heart stopped in her tomato garden in 1978, the bells of every safe village rang 47 times, and every survivor, every reclaimed child, every mother who had been told her baby died, every Lakota grandmother, every Iowa farmer, every news crew, every donor, every neighbor, every soul who had ever been touched by her story began walking toward the circle carrying the red ribbon from their own key, the ones we had mailed out with every adoption file, every DNA Result every apology letter, every court document, and by 7 o'clock there were more than 60,000 people standing shoulder to shoulder in the snow silent waiting, and I walked to the statue carrying the very first red ribbon, the one that had been tied around the church key in 2012, the one that started it all of this, and I climbed the little ladder we keep behind her, and I looped that ribbon through her bronze fingers and let it fall, and then one by one every person came forward and tied their ribbon to the one before until the single red cord grew longer and longer and longer until it reached all the way from her hand to the ground level and wrapped around the entire circle 3 full times like a river of blood turned into love, and the cameras caught every second live on every network in the world, and grandmas everywhere were sobbing into their grandchildren's hair because they knew what it meant. The circle was finally closed. At 7:24 p.m., the exact moment she would have reached her back door in 1978, the wind stopped, the snow stopped, even the stars seemed to hold their breath, and a single perfect snowflake landed on the tip of her bronze nose and stayed there glowing in the lights like a diamond, and I swear on everything holy every single one of us felt it at the same second, a warmth like summer sunshine pour over us, and heard her bell laugh clear as church bells on Easter morning, and every child in the village looked up at the statue and said in one voice, "Hi Grandma Evelyn, we're home," and the grown-ups lost it completely because we knew she had come to see her victory with her own eyes. Leonard Little Hawk stepped forward with the last tiny star quilt, the one that had wrapped the final baby brought home from Belgium, and he laid it at her feet and said in Lakota and then in English, "The grandmothers have won, the children are safe, the monsters are gone, go rest now sister," and the second he finished speaking the northern lights exploded across the Minnesota sky, green and purple and red dancing like fire, and every phone camera in the crowd turned upward and the whole world saw it. Live the aurora borealis on Christmas Eve in a place it had never been recorded before, and people fell to their knees in the snow laughing and crying because they knew it was her saying thank you and goodbye and I love you all. At 8 o'clock sharp the bells rang one final time, and the choir of every child who had ever slept safe because of her began singing Silent Night in 37 languages, and the sound rose up into that impossible sky, and I stood there with Grandma's wedding ring on my pinky, the red ribbon river at my feet, the warmth of 60,000 hearts beating as one, and I whispered, "Merry Christmas Grandma, we did it, every last child is home, every last monster fell, love grew where tomatoes grow, and kindness finally beat meanness every single time," and the northern lights flared one last time brighter than the sun and then folded themselves away like a curtain closing on the most beautiful play ever written, and the snow started falling again, soft and gentle, covering our tears, turning them into diamonds on the ground. The next morning, Christmas Day 2025, the statue was different. The little red gift box she had been holding for 47 years was empty. The bronze lid was open, and inside, resting on red velvet, was a single fresh butterscotch candy wrapped in crinkly gold paper, exactly like the ones she used to slip me after church, and nobody can explain how it got there because the statue is solid bronze poured in one piece. But every child in the village swears they smelled lilacs and chokecherry jelly at sunrise, and the candy was warm like it had just come from her pocket, and we all knew she had laid down her long watch and gone home for good. Today the Safe Village has 7 campuses on 3 continents, and more than 147,000 children have slept safe under roofs built with the money she stole from the devils themselves, and every Christmas Eve the Red Ribbon River is untied and retied by new children who never knew her but call her Grandma Evelyn anyway, and every spring the tomato gardens bloom so thick you can smell them from the highway, and every single child plants one plant with their own name on a popsicle stick because love grows where tomatoes grow, and every single night it lights out the house. Parents whisper the same words into the dark: be brave, kindness is stronger than meanness. Every single time. And somewhere up there under an eternal tomato sky, a tiny barefoot woman with snow in her hair laughs that bell laugh and says, that's my good and brave children, keep the circle wide. My name is Tommy Carter. I was 8 years old the night my father locked my grandma out in the snow for giving me one small gift, and 47 years later on the night love finally won, I laid that butterscotch candy on her statue's open palm, closed the little bronze box, and whispered, Merry Christmas Grandma, thank you for the best gift anybody ever gave the world. You won everything. And the northern lights answered one soft flicker like a wink, and I knew she heard me. So if you are still here, thank you for walking this long road with us. Thank you for crying with us. Thank you for believing a 74-year-old barefoot woman could bring down an empire of evil with nothing but love and butterscotch and a heart that refused to quit. If this story touched you even a little, please share it with every grandma, every parent, every child you know, because the circle only stays closed if we keep telling it. And if you can spare even 5 seconds to subscribe, because Grandma is still watching, and she is still proud, and she is still barefoot and warm and waiting under the northern lights for every single one of us to come home. From my heart to yours this Christmas Eve 2025, thank you for letting me tell you about the strongest woman who ever lived, my grandma Evelyn Mae Carter. The night love won. God bless every one of you. Go hug your people tight, and I will see you under the tomato sky. Please subscribe for more stories every day.